Week 6, Overview, Medieval Life, Feudalism. This week, we get to look at the heart of what people think about when you say the Middle Ages. We're studying feudalism and an era of knights and castles. We'll focus on the major dynasties of Europe this week, in England, France, and Germany. The form of government in all these lands was feudalism. One major strand of feudalism first appeared under Charlemagne back in 800. His system of vassals who managed lands and supplied arms made it possible for overlords to govern more territory more effectively. Though Charlemagne's central government dissolved after his death, the notion of delegated ownership of land lived on. As the Vikings menaced Europe, strong warriors emerged as overlords, who portioned out their lands to lesser lords, who subdivided that among their vassals. The peasants had no part in this system of multi-level government, only the nobility. The saying was, "No land without a lord, no lord without a land." A lord was a noble who owned land, and a vassal was a person who was granted possession of that land in exchange for military service to the lord. The land the lord gave the vassal was called a fief. There was a ceremony that made a man a vassal, which included two specific actions. First, the vassal rendered homage, a French word for man. This made the vassal the lord's loyal man, who promised to fight on the lord's behalf. Second, he took an oath of fealty, which means faithfulness. Feudalism was a multi-level system because one man's vassal could, in turn, be lord of another. Once a vassal acquired a fief, he could entrust it to some lesser lord. This made for a whole chain of feudal relationships. In theory, the emperor was lord of kings, who were the lords of the peers of the realm, who were lords of the lesser nobility, who were lords of knights. Every lord was master of the peasant on the manor who tilled the land. The peasants weren't really part of this feudal system. Feudalism wasn't just a secular system. The Church had already developed a similar hierarchical pattern, with the Pope at the top and the layman at the bottom. In addition, after centuries of donations by landowners, churches and monasteries held vast tracts of land which they could distribute as fiefs to bishops and abbots, or to barons and knights. This meant that church leaders became lords in their own right, with troops at their command. The peasants were a third class altogether. Unlike the nobles and clergy, they didn't rule anything. For all practical purposes, they were a part of the property that the nobles or clergy controlled. Peasants were bound to the land and whoever controlled it. Because the peasants weren't governed by the feudal oaths, like fealty and homage, it wouldn't be accurate to call them a part of the feudal system. The system of peasant labor in the Middle Ages has different names. It's known as manorialism. This refers to the economic relationship between the lord of the manor and his peasant tenants. Feudalism, by contrast, was a political and military system, not an economic system. It's like the difference between capitalism and democracy. One is an economic system, the other is political. Manorialism and feudalism went together like capitalism and democracy. So, let's take a look at some of the individuals who lived and ruled in this feudal era. We'll examine the ruling houses of what turned into the modern nation-states of England, France, and Germany. In England, there was William the Conqueror. He was a Norman, descended from the Vikings who conquered northern France. William led a band of Norman knights across the English Channel and defeated the Saxon king in a single battle at Hastings. He then established a strong central government, centered on London, where he built a castle called the Tower of London. As king, William claimed all the land of England and then parceled it out as fiefs to his vassals, the great Norman lords, who parceled it out in turn to lesser vassals, all the way down to the lowest knights. The Angles and the Saxons who had ruled England became serfs, bound to work the land they lived on. There were struggles between medieval kings and the great lords who served them. England was different from most other places in that the kings won all these struggles at first. Next week, we'll study an exception to that rule. A few generations after William the Conqueror, in the era of Robin Hood, that's when wily Prince John was forced to negotiate a deal with his rebellious barons and wound up signing the Magna Carta. For now, it's enough to note that Norman England started off with a central government that was relatively strong. Well before William conquered England, another line of kings was gaining power over France. You recall Charlemagne, who united much of France, Germany, and Italy when he was crowned emperor in AD 800. His grandson split the empire up, and before 2 centuries were out, the nobles of the realm threw out the Carolingians and chose another line of kings. They elected Hugh Capet as king, and many historians date the founding of France to the coronation of this first Capetian king. For a long time, the Capets controlled only a small area of land between Paris and the city of Orleans. Other great noblemen ruled their own domains with little regard for the king. The Dukes of Normandy were the most powerful. Although they were technically vassals of the King of France, they ruled all of England too. But the family of Capet grew stronger over time. Every king had a son to succeed him on the throne, and they kept adding territory to their personal lands. Though still powerful in their own domains, the nobles slowly lost the power to choose the next king, and when the Crusades began in 1100, many nobles left France to fight the Muslims for the Holy Land. This only increased the slowly growing power of the French kings. In Germany, things took a different tack. Otto the Great bit off more than he could chew. Otto's father was Henry I, King of Germany. In 951, Otto crossed the Alps and declared himself King of Italy. It wasn't easy to maintain control over his Germanic lands. During his absence, the other German princes began revolting against his rule. The Slavs of Poland rebelled against his rule at the same time, and a fierce people known as the Magyars invaded Germany from the east. Otto fought back, though, crushing the Magyars, subduing the Poles, and replacing the German princes with members of his own family. 10 years after he crossed the Alps for the first time, he crossed them again to squash an uprising in Rome. In gratitude, Pope John XII crowned him emperor of what later came to be called the Holy Roman Empire. This so-called empire, best summed up by the observation that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, never developed into a nation-state. Instead, it was the setting for one of the most famous conflicts between church and state in the Middle Ages. A few generations after Otto, an exceptionally able and energetic monk named Hildebrand became Pope Gregory VII. Pope Gregory made a number of important reforms to the church. One of them was that he prohibited secular rulers from making appointments to church offices. This practice, called investiture, had been an important source of funds for some time, since high officials in the church received the tithe money, and there were people who were willing to pay a lot to be appointed to such a lucrative office. When Pope Gregory decreed that secular officials must stop choosing church leaders, the German king, Henry VI, objected. He did more than object. He called a council at the German city of Worms in 1076 and declared the pope deposed. Henry's father, Henry III, had gotten several popes elected and or deposed, so the son thought he was well within his rights. Pope Gregory excommunicated Henry for this and released all his vassals from their vows to obey him. Thus, both the pope and the king attempted to depose the other. Because of feudalism, Henry depended upon the support of his vassals, and many of the German princes sided with the pope. Eventually, Henry had to yield. The pope had retreated to a stronghold in the mountains of Italy, and they say that he made Henry stand barefoot in the snow for 3 days before he could kneel at the pope's feet and be pardoned. That wasn't the end of the story, though. When Henry went back to Germany, civil war broke out again. And Gregory excommunicated and deposed Henry a second time, and Henry captured Rome and put in a pope of his own choice. The new pope crowned Henry Holy Roman Emperor. Gregory died in exile, but his successors took up the struggle, and Henry was excommunicated one more time. When one of Henry's sons rebelled against him, the father was finally forced to abdicate. He died while preparing to fight to regain power. Now, although I've been talking about England, France, and Germany, these nations didn't yet exist as such. The land was there, of course, but much of Europe was fragmented into tiny kingdoms and principalities that warred almost constantly with one another. People thought of themselves as Angles or Saxons or Normans, not citizens of England. Men were much more defined by their feudal or tribal relationships than by any national loyalty. This changed over time, however. The nature of that change is a central focus for older students this year. How and why did people change their allegiance from individual tribes to nation-states? We can see this development most easily in England. England was one of the earliest European countries to develop a national identity. There were several reasons for this. Being an island was an advantage. You never quite know where France ends and Germany begins, but it's easy to tell where England stops. But that wasn't the only advantage that England had. William the Conqueror had an unchallenged claim to all the land his army conquered, and every one of his vassals started off on the same footing. In France, by contrast, some lords had as much power and prestige as the kings they swore fealty to. In Germany and Italy, the so-called emperors never really had a chance to unify the people into one nation. The Alps were too much of a barrier, and the popes were too eager to interfere with the gradual process of nation-building. These medieval kings and their people paint a picture of a dynamic society that was changing over time. The ebb and flow of history eventually created the boundary lines of modern Europe. We can learn about the world we live in by studying these conflicts between kings and barons, or popes and emperors.